I am one of these mistakes that parents make, maybe. They weren't, wasn't exactly planned, I don't think. This is my opinion, because my sisters were 12 and 14 years older than I am, and I don't think there was a plan for another, especially a girl. They wouldn't mind if I'd have been a boy, but I turned out to be a third girl. And my mother had rheumatoid arthritis from even before I was born. So I was to be born at Christmas time, but instead I appeared on Thanksgiving Day. I was born at home. My sisters were sent to grandmother's house, which was just right up the street. I never found out whether they had a Thanksgiving dinner that day or not, but I guess my sisters did, but I don't know about my dad, and I'm sure my mother didn't. And let me see, my next recollection is my parents, my mother had there were five girls and two boys in her family. So I had lots of aunts and uncles and cousins, and Dad had one brother, two sisters. So there were a lot of relatives, and 90% of them lived right there in Thurmont. So I had lots and lots of cousins and relatives, as I say. And Mom and Dad always played tennis with aunts, and they played cards also, 500 in those days. And I think I was about 3 or 4, and I remember Uncle Howard, Mother's sister's husband, had a sawmill or wood of something or another, and they had a tennis court. They built a tennis court on this property, and they were playing tennis, and we kids were left on our own, and there was a little road into the place, and some young boys had a little pony cart, I guess, and were coming in the road, and we all ran to get on the other side of this road where our parents were. And I stumbled and fell over a rock or something, and the front feet of the pony went over me, and my mother saw what was happening and had presence of mind to pull me out before the back feet tromped me and the cart ran over me. And that's probably my first recollection of anything. And then another time, there was a little, like, railroad car that took the wood after it had been cut along a little railroad track thing. And we used to love to play in this, but one time, I don't know why there wasn't something to stop it at the other end, but as my usual way of getting in trouble, I don't think it stopped, and I was in it, and I think I went over the end, but that time, that wasn't much of anything. Nothing happened. My next big recollection, I was age 5. My sister was getting married, and I was to be the flower girl. And so different from today's world. I don't even remember how I was dressed or anything else, but I remember I was to carry a basket of rose petals and strew them, go down the aisle of the church first and strew the rose petals. But I was completely ignored, and so everybody forgot that I was to have rose petals. So what I had was an empty basket, and I was to pretend that I was strewing rose petals. Well, that was a horrible experience for a 5-year-old to be part of the wedding and not have what she was supposed to have. But this sort of tells you that I was an afterthought, I think, all the way through. My next recollection is my sister had a baby, and she was living in Lancaster, and we went to the hospital to see this newborn babe who wasn't very handsome and large and not very good looking at that point. And in the nursery were a pair of black twins that had been abandoned. And I just begged my parents to take those black twins home with us. They were the cutest little things. And, but of course, they weren't the least bit interested in taking 2 children home. But let me see. Next. Turn it off for a second till I think. Ready? Okay, my next experience was I would be 6 in November, but I was allowed to start to school at age 5 in I was age 5 in September, and I wouldn't be 6 until November. But I started to school, and that year my older sister was in college, and my younger sister was a senior in high school. And so I was sent to school, and my sister took care of me, and I would go up to the senior room and have lunch many days with my sister. And I'm sure I was in the way many times, but she was very kind and took good care of me. And that was my first grade experience. And that year, a neighbor was my first grade teacher. My Aunt Anna was my second grade teacher. And to top it all off, my third grade teacher was my sister Catherine. She was a substitute that year. But my dad said to me the day she first started teaching, "Now you must behave in Catherine's class or you'll get a spanking when you come home." Well, consequently, having had my aunt as my second grade teacher and my sister as my third grade teacher and neighbors as my fourth grade teacher and my first grade teacher, and the fifth grade also were either neighbors or friends of my parents, I became a holy terror in school, and I never did very well up until then. And by that time I was spoiled rotten. And I always contend that it wasn't fair to a child to have had relatives or friends be teachers. And then let me see. Then my next big experience, I would say, was when I was 14. My grandmother lived up the street, and there was a stream of water behind her house, and it also ran behind my parents' house. And in the summertime, we didn't have a swimming pool. We would go and dam up the stream so that it would be deep enough for you to, up to your chest. It wouldn't be a deep pool, but it would be as high as your chest. And on the bank of the stream was poison ivy, and everybody else was afraid to pull the poison ivy out. And I said, well, I'm in my bathing suit, soaking wet, and I said, well, let me do it. I've never had poison ivy. I'll pull it out. Well, if you know poison ivy, the worst thing you can do is to pull it out wet and in a bathing suit yet, and pull it out by the roots. So I did this, and the next morning I got up to go to church, and I looked like a red balloon. I was covered with poison ivy. It ended up going down to my feet, and I had infections all over them. It ended up that for a month or 6 weeks afterwards, I had infections all over my body. They had to lance my face in 2 or 3 places. They had to cut a piece of toenail off because it got underneath my toes, and my feet were raw for a month. The first month of my freshman year, I guess it was my junior year of high school, I wasn't able to walk or go to school because I had this infection all over my body. My only grandmother died that year, but somehow it didn't impress me so much because by this time she had moved with my cousin to Washington, so I didn't see a lot of her anyhow. But then my next experience was, let me see, I had my first real date at age 15, but I didn't particularly care for the boy. My mother thought he was very cute because he had curly hair. And then let me see, age 16 I can't remember too much about, but 17 I had a very dear friend who was a gorgeous redhead, and that's early summer. She developed peritonitis in a ruptured appendix, and I went around town blaming the doctor for not diagnosing the appendix, the burst appendix for a whole week. I just think if he had known what happened a week ahead of time, she would have still been alive, but who knows. Anyhow, it deeply affected me, much more than my grandmother, because she was my best friend, and I always said that I wanted to have red-haired children, but in fact, I guess it was the next year that I met a red-haired boy that I dated for a while, but I decided that he had to offer more than red hair for me to be interested in him, so I said goodbye to him. Let me see. I met your dad at age 19. He was a sophomore at Gettysburg at the time, and I was dating his roommate, and a friend of his was coming down to visit one of my friends, and they were having a little party at her house, and they asked me to get a date for your father. So I did, but he didn't like the girl that I got him a date with, and she said she would come to the party if he would translate her French that night. So he said yes, he would translate her French, but I was helping him write down the translation, and I thought, I sort of like him better than I liked the boy that I was dating, but it just sort of went in my mind and out again. And then that was the end of the sophomore year. And then the beginning of the junior year, I went to school down in Baltimore. And when I would come home one weekend, my sister Catherine, who was home, said somebody with a Pennsylvania license came calling for you. And I didn't think anything of it. I thought it was probably the boy I had been dating. And so then it happened a weekend that I wasn't home. So then a weekend that I was home, I had a house full of girls, and we were having just a good old girl fest, and the doorbell rang, and it was your dad standing at the door. And he said, I was at a convention in Baltimore, a chemical convention, and I just came home this way, and wondering how you were doing. And I said, oh, I'm doing fine, come on in. So it started raining, and my girlfriends lived on the other side of town. And I said, would you be willing to take the girls home? And he had a little tiny coupe, and one girl was on the plump side, and she had two sisters. So that's three. Him, your dad, and myself made five, crawled in the little coupe, and we took them home. And then he brought me home, and on the way home he said, the fraternity is having a dance tomorrow night, would you like to go with me? And I said yes. That started our friendship. And his friend was having my friend go, so the four of us went together. And then every dance or party that they had from then on for the rest of the year, we went together. And your dad and I, that is. I don't know if Pat went every time. But at the end of the year, he asked me if I would like to become engaged, and I wasn't ready to, but I said, oh, well, I'll wear your pin, fraternity pin. And that summer he had to go to ROTC camp, and then after ROTC camp, my friend Pat's aunt lived up in Towanda, I think, Pennsylvania, New York border, had a summer place and invited us, the four, well, Pat was already up there, that invited your dad's friend and myself and your dad up to spend a weekend, and we all went up and spent the weekend up there at the summer place. And it was very interesting because I loved to swim at that point, and I was really excited over a nice little lake. And your dad said he didn't want to go swimming. He had an infection on his legs, I think. So he wouldn't go near the water. And I didn't realize until one of his fraternity brothers told me later that he didn't swim. When he was a young boy, he went to the Y to take swimming lessons, and the instructor threw him in the water and said, sink or swim. Scared him so bad he never wanted to go near the water again, and I never did get him to go swimming. We went sailing, but we never went swimming together. So anyhow, come fall, and I don't know if I ever told you this, his parent, well, on the way home from that trip, he was celebrating his 21st birthday, and I hadn't met his parents or anything at this point, so I was invited to spend the night with he and his parents. And she had just a family birthday dinner for him. And then we went walking in the park and came home, and nothing exciting, but his father was quite a bit old for having a son 21. I think he was, well, he was 57, so he must have been when Frank was born, so he must have been in his 70s, but his mother was at least 20, 25 years younger. But anyhow, then we came on back to Thurmont, and I guess I didn't see him again until he came back to school at Gettysburg for his senior year. And I think we went to one party together, and then I had a letter from his parents saying that they felt that their son was too young to get married, and that if we married before he finished college, they would take his college support for college away from him. And I had no intentions of getting married before college was over, because in those days very few people got married while they were in college, and I had no intentions of this. So I wrote him a nasty letter back and said, "You can keep your son, I don't want him." And so I didn't see him all his senior year of college after that. And then one of my friend's father was the baseball coach, I guess, at Gettysburg. And I went up with them one day to a ball game, and I saw your dad, but just briefly, and nothing at all, really. And but this time I was regretting my words, because I thought he was the best thing that came down the road as far as I was concerned. But I had other friends at that point, and so I didn't worry about it too much. But I did send him a card when he graduated. And immediately after graduation, then he went into the service, having ROTC, as a second lieutenant, and was stationed at Fort Polk, Camp Polk at that time, Louisiana. So along about July, he's now on his own, and he writes me a letter and said he would be interested in stopping to see me when he comes north, because he was being sent to Fort Knox for studies. And so I wrote back and said I'd love to see him again. And so when he came to Fort Knox at the end of, I guess it was a month or 6 weeks, maybe, I guess 6 weeks course that he took at Knox, then he had leave, and then he came and spent some time with me at Thurmont. And before he left, we became officially engaged again. And then he, before he left for Camp Polk again, he got orders to come to Edgewood Arsenal, which is in Maryland, for a month's study. And so he had to go back to Camp Polk just long enough to check in, and then immediately come back to Maryland. So after he was there for about 2 weeks, I thought, if he goes back to Louisiana, which is the other end of the world as far as I'm concerned, I'd better catch this guy and marry him. So I told him that before he left, we would get married again. We would get married. And I sent him a postcard, which I still have, telling the dates. We got our marriage license, because you had to get a marriage license, and the only thing it was you go to the courthouse and apply for a marriage license. You didn't have to have a physical or anything. And Maryland in those days was a state where you could get married almost immediately after you got your license. And so a lot of people from other states came to Maryland to get married, but that's beside the point. But anyhow, as I say, his third week in school at Edgewood Arsenal, I said, this is the time for us to get married now, so we did. And then we went back to Baltimore for his last week in schooling. And when, let me see, we stayed at the Lord Baltimore Hotel, which was the hotel in Baltimore. And the next morning, after we got married, which was December the 6th, 1941, we went out apartment hunting or room hunting just for a week, because we couldn't afford to stay at the hotel for a whole week. And so I had a friend who was married and lived in Baltimore, and they went with us to find a very nice room. And then we went back to his parents' house, and his mother was listening to the radio, and she said, "Have you heard? Pearl Harbor has been bombed." And this was exactly when we had been married 12 hours. So I was really upset. And but he had to go back to class the next morning, and they weren't sure how to handle all these men who were in the service at that point, not knowing what was coming next. They said, "Okay, no one can leave the compound tonight." And your daddy didn't know where I was staying, didn't have a phone call. He knew how to get there, but I mean, he didn't have a phone number. And so anyhow, the other men in the class said, "Well, if worse comes to worse, we'll put you across the fence, and you can go home and tell your new bride that you haven't deserted her. You're restricted to the post." But before the day was over, they decided that was sort of foolish, and so they let him come home. And he came back, and we spent the week in Baltimore. And then Friday afternoon was the last day of class, and he came in and said, "Well, I have my orders." And he was given 2 weeks of leave, which took him to the day after Christmas. So we had 2 weeks together. And the day after Christmas, then he had to go back to Louisiana. And at that point, I wasn't sure when I would join him. But it was only 2 weeks later that his commanding officer, who was a captain at that point, his wife lived in Washington, and she was driving to Louisiana, and they arranged for me to drive down to Louisiana with her. And that pretty much takes me through my youth.